afternoon.
On data protection authorities network from regional cooperation to global convergence. Today, we have a panel of expert guest speakers representing the regions of Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Our speakers will talk about the experience and challenges that data protection authorities face in the different regions, and within that diversity of experiences, we'll try to look at common challenges that can build synergies. International cooperation is a matter of utmost importance. Privacy issues often have global reach, and this places greater pressure upon relevant authorities to work together in the development of compatible, if not common, policies. The demand for the protection of personal data knows no border. As data moves across borders, the protection must travel along. The increasing prevalence of global data flows challenges the ability to ensure the protection of human rights at the local and regional levels, making domestic supervision authorities to conduct investigations abroad. In this globalized scenario, many regions, and many like Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa, you name it, and regional organizations such as G20, G7, the Council of Europe, etc., are key actors to develop bridges between different privacy systems to the benefit of citizens and business owners. It's my pleasure to host the very first panel that is composed by chairs of three different regional networks of data protection authorities. This includes Europe, Latin America, and Africa. This can be the opportunity to show that these networks and the data protection authorities that are parties face common challenges and can generate similar opportunities and synergies. In developing more consistent interpretation of data protection rules within a region, incorporating and enforcement with cross-border effects, and etc. Not only regionally, but also with global reach. It could be also the first step to a closer dialogue between the networks. So, one of the topics we're going to discuss is what is happening on the ground in the regional in terms of consolidation of your network, especially talking regionally. What are the prospects for development in the short to middle term? And what are the main difficulties and challenges your network faces today? Institutionalization, financing, or the recognition by public and private stakeholders, or the visibility among citizens. What are the tools your network has put in place to strengthen cooperation between partners? Or are the cooperation mechanisms set within your network effective? Or are they used now by enforcement? Or are these mechanisms absolute or being modernized? What are the main benefits and achievements for your regional derived cooperation? This is going to be the global overview of our panel today. For me, it's a pleasure to have this afternoon here in Mexico, good night in Europe and in Africa and the rest of the world, to Nelson Remolina, who is the chair of the Ibero-American Data Protection Network. Also, we have an Andrea Jelinek, the chair of the European Data Protection Board. And we have Professor José Luis Piñar Mañas, Vice Rector of the Vice Dean of the International Affairs for CEU Universities in São Paulo, Madrid. And they're going to speak exactly in the same order. The rules are the following. All the persons are going to have an introduction by 5 or 7 minutes each. Then we're going to move to a general conversation depending on the conclusions on the first part. And if we have some time at the very end, we can collect a couple of questions or continue talking on these topics. If everyone is ready, I'm going to pass the floor to Mr. Nelson Remolina, Chair of the Ibero-American Data Protection Network. Nelson.
¿Me escuchan bien?
Can you hear me? Very well. Good afternoon. It is an honor to take part in this event with all of you. I'd like to thank the INAI for the effort, your great work to organize this event. Congratulate Mexico for hosting the most important event in the world with respect to data treatment. And also I'd like to greet my colleagues, Andrea, Professor Jose Luis. Jose Luis can talk about the Latin American Network of Data Protection. You are the founder of this network. So you are very familiarized with this network, but also a pioneer in these issues of promoting a culture of data privacy, not only in Latin America, but around the world. I have a small presentation to formulate some ideas, and we will keep on discussing them or working on them. Please, next slide. Very well. I'll talk about the Latin American Network of Data Protection. This network was born 18 years ago. It was founded by José Luis Piñar and a group of experts, academicians, and authorities who met in Antigua, Guatemala in June of 2003. And from that date to date, everything has changed. Some are the same, but there are other challenges. At that time, the main objective was to create regulations for data protection in the Latin American countries. That wasn't the case. It didn't exist in all the countries. Today, it's around 60–70% of the countries, but at that point, only 2 or 3 countries had data protection regulations. So the first issue was to introduce the regulations of the Latin American countries, this right, how to protect it, and communicate everyone the scope of their rights with respect to their information. From that date to now, as you can see, our network is formed by 35 organizations. 17 of them are authorities of countries. You can see Mexico, Spain, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, Uruguay, Portugal, Brazil, Andorra. This year, for us, has been an honor that Brazil is part of our network. It is the last member country, but we also have observers who are part of the network, like the OAS, the European Supervisor, the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, and the Council of Europe, among others. Now, the network has had a very important dynamics with constant communication to increasingly work in our mission, that is the proper treatment of people's data. So here you can see some news in our website that communicate to the public, but also to other authorities, what we are doing, events, research, new publications, new guidelines to be communicated with the members of the network and the community. And this is very important in terms of cooperation. And communication is very important. Well, we can do many things just by speaking through these means, by phone, and acting swiftly. So I think that one of the challenges that we have is to act before any situation that can happen anywhere with respect to the violation of fundamental rights like data protection. Next one, please. I'd like to highlight the following, and it is the context where we live. We are in cyberspace, as you know. A few years ago, well, after internet, 1994, the world population was, well, only 1% had access to internet. Now it's 65%. We are talking about 5 billion people. Those are the cyber citizens from around the world. So while we have a world divided into territories, in turn, we also have a world that is merged with technology. And through technologies, we are gathering data from any part of the world at all times. That's the reality. Those are the challenges or the socio-technological reality in this century, and we have to act fastly before this. We can't still see law as it was before because internet in 15 years changed many things. Actually, the challenge is to act quickly. So therefore, cooperation is essential. But something you might know, and it is important to highlight, when there's an incident on the internet in any part of the world, this affects massively citizens from all the world. And this is my first message for you. All of us, the authorities, should act massively before any incident on the internet, because this is immediately affecting citizens from all parts of the world. So it is fundamental, essential, to act as a team quickly, because if we do not act like this, we're not going to be strong, and we need to be very strong to protect this right, because those who use our data are public entities and companies. They are the most powerful in the world. So we should also be a good team, act in coordination to demand the respect for this right. It is not about acting against anyone, but all the authorities within the framework of our competencies demand any organization in our country or abroad to respect the rights of people. And another important idea is that internet can't be a place for impunity. I repeat, internet can't be a place for impunity with respect to data use. Technological advances can't be a tool to violate the rights of people. Neither being in many territories can be an excuse not to protect the rights of people. There are many challenges and we have to act. And that's very important. As authorities, we have to do everything possible, but also we should know that it's not only about the authorities, but it depends on the ethical and serious commitment of organizations, but also each person as holder of the rights, so that he or she is the main advocate for their rights. So I'd like to wrap up by showing something that in the Latin American Network of Data Protection was agreed upon in the last strategic plan approved in December of 2020. And this is something I already mentioned. The network in Article 45 talks about cooperation, but in this numeral 4, we expressed something I already mentioned. And it is that all the authorities of the network should identify actual cases that affect citizens from many countries, and we should act according to our competencies to face this. Is to ask for explanations on what happened. Maybe a security incident can happen anywhere and affects everyone. What happened, how many citizens were affected, the measures taken for this incident not to happen again, but all the authorities should ask and insist, and I highlight something very important from the beginning. We have to be very proactive to improve a better data protection. So those are the ideas I wanted to present, but later we can elaborate on some of them. Thank you very much.
Nelson. I will go now. I will pass the floor to Andrea Jelinek, the chair of the European Data Protection Board. I just want to highlight some of the things that Mr. Remolina was saying about the challenges, and especially highlight this thing that is important and probably going to go along on all our conversation, that it's impunity. And despite the fact that the current society is taking advantages of technology, this is not the it is not the opportunity to increase impunity. On the contrary, we need to fight all the impunity and protect citizens and their rights. So I'm going to pass the floor to Andrea Jelinek, the chair of the European Data Protection now. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. Hi, Nelson and Jose Luis, esteemed colleagues from around the world. It is my honor and pleasure to take part in this panel. The Global Privacy Assembly is an important yearly appointment. Every autumn, I look forward to our discussions and exchanges of best practices. I would like to congratulate the Mexican colleagues and the GPA Secretariat for the efficient organization of this edition. Despite very complicated circumstances and many logistical challenges, they have made this important annual highlight possible for all of us. Les deseo un congreso muy exitoso.
I wish you a very successful assembly.
For me, this afternoon's panel touches upon the essence of the Global Privacy Assembly, learning from each other's experience and identifying where we can support each other and work together. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, even more social and economic activities have moved online. And with this, the importance of privacy and data protection is increasingly recognized. 128 out of 195 countries worldwide have now put in place legislation to secure the protection of data. In Europe, technological developments have driven the development of data protection laws since the 1970s, culminating in the adoption of data protection legislation in 1995. 20 years later, the 1995 Data Protection Directive was due for a thorough makeover to answer the data protection needs of our time. In Europe, we opted for one overarching law to ensure a high level of legal certainty and transparency for both businesses and citizens. This drive for harmonization led to the adoption of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. The GDPR introduced common rules of the game. It creates a level playing field and ensures that data can move easily between operators within Europe, while guaranteeing the consistent protection of individuals' personal data. We have one set of privacy rules that are interpreted in a uniform manner throughout the European Economic Area, the EEA. That means in the European Union, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. The European Data Protection Board was established by the GDPR to play a key role in this process. It is not enough to have robust laws. It is also important that these laws are enforced and that this enforcement happens in a consistent manner throughout the region. To this end, the EDPB groups the EEA supervisory authorities together, and together we ensure a harmonized application of the GDPR throughout the European Economic Area, as well as the consistent protection of all EEA data subjects, regardless of where they live. Our task is to ensure that all EEA regulators are on the same page and to provide guidance to this end. The EDPB's strength lies in the fact that it combines the knowledge and expertise of the national regulators that are close to the situation on the ground in their respective countries, with a strong drive towards harmonization and consistency. The SAs have seen their enforcement powers increased with the GDPR. They are now able to impose fines of 20 million euros or up to 4% of an organization's global turnover, whichever is higher. In addition, the EEA supervisory authorities cooperate much more intensely than they did prior to the GDPR via the cooperation and consistency procedures and via numerous informal daily exchanges. So far, over 1,700 cross-border cases have been created in the Common Case Register, with 277 final decisions taken so far. As data move across borders, the ETPP also looks beyond the geographical limits of the European Economic Area, which includes all EU countries and non-EU countries, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. The global dimension of our work is very important to us, and we invest many resources in this. The ETPP 2021 until 2023 strategy includes a specific chapter dedicated to the global dimension of data protection. We continue to pay a great deal of attention to the international transfers of data. We continue to while the GDPR aims to ensure a consistent protection, enabling free circulation of data in the EU, when personal data are transferred outside the European Economic Area, special safeguards are foreseen to ensure that the protection travels with the data. One way in which countries can achieve closer alignment is being recognized as an adequate third country by the European Commission. The effect of such a decision is that personal data can flow from the EEA to that third country in the same manner it can flow within the EEA. To be granted adequacy, the European Union does not require that the laws in the third country are identical to the GDPR. Adequacy aims to develop the convergence I mentioned earlier between divergent systems and has essential equivalence as its guiding principle. This means that the level of protection for personal data transferred from the European Union is granted that is essentially equivalent to the one guaranteed by the GDPR. The European Commission has so far recognized 13 countries as diverse as Canada, Argentina, and Japan as providing adequate protection. As shown by the Japanese adequacy decision in 2018, the European Union recognized that a high level of protection can be achieved through different means, reflecting different legal and societal cultures and different historical backgrounds. While adequacy findings are available to those countries that meet the relevant criteria, EU data protection legislation offers a diversified toolkit of mechanisms to transfer data to third countries: standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, certification mechanism, codes of conduct, administrative arrangements between public authorities, and so-called derogations. The default rule for such transfers is that they should only take place if the level of protection the GDPR grants to personal data is not undermined by doing so. All of these tools have a contractual nature in common, with clearly established rights and duties for data controllers. Other countries around the world are using similar contract-based tools. In our interconnected digital world, it is important that data can be shared with the necessary protection inside and outside the European Union. In recent years, we have seen that the idea that individuals should have strong and enforceable data protection rights guaranteed by an independent regulator has been gaining ground worldwide. We also notice convergence around the idea that the protection of personal data must travel with the data when it is transferred. I find these developments very encouraging. They give me hope that although differentiations and uncertainties remain, there is a potential for worldwide convergence. Naturally, the ETPP is available to exchange good practices with our colleagues worldwide, with you all. We are also eager to learn from other countries. This conference shows that, despite the diversity of our legal cultures, backgrounds, instruments, we all share the same objective, the same driver, the same ideal: protecting the rights of our people in the new digital era. Through our joint efforts, I'm sure that the convergence of our countries on data protection standards is just a matter of time. Thanks for your support. Gracias por vuestro apoyo. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's a pleasure to hear you, especially when you were stressing on how different countries with different traditions and different initiatives, you put them together in this general framework, legal framework, and basically what you are trying to create is minimal standards. And actually, the European experience is relevant in the case that you are recognizing also all countries in other regions, especially if they have high standards, they can add themselves into this process, and you are recognizing. So it's not just an effort for European countries, but also for many other countries who has the reference of what the European Union is doing, and especially when it comes to data protection, but also because you have been creating a framework not only for data protection, but also to protect human rights related to data protection, when it includes, for instance, children's and other violations of human rights. From that, I'm gonna pass the floor to Jose Luis Piñar, who is the Vice Rector for the International Affairs. It's a really long name, but I'm gonna try to do it. To my Director for International Affairs for the CEU University for San Pablo, and former Director of the Spanish Data in España. So, José Luis, the floor is yours. Por favor.
Sí. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Ballinas, thank you so much. I am really pleased to be here, participating with Andrea, Nelson, in this very important event. I should say, for me, it is an honor to be able to participate together with other data protection officials. I no longer am an authority, but I'm rather an former director of the agency, and in that sense, I truly want to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to join you in this very interesting seminar after having listened to Nelson and Andrea. The topic we are addressing is essential, and it's probably one of the most important ones today: the protection of data. To be able to gain a global application and an efficient application for the protection of fundamental rights. And that means achieving a global effectiveness. And another fundamental right, that of data protection of personal data. Some time ago, certain channels or ways were proposed to achieve this global unification for data protection. I will recall the declaration of 2009 in Madrid, then another one for international standards and the protection of privacy in relation to personal data, or the declaration of the Warsaw Conference, the 25th one, where it was agreed, oh no, that rather the 15th, not the 25th. It was agreed, an additional protocol was agreed, additional to Article 17 of the International Pact for Civil and Political Rights. In that Article 17, we all know it acknowledges the right to privacy and the right of protection against any attacks against privacy. One protocol that would enable the creation of globally applicable standards for data protection in accordance with the will of law. Those were initiatives that are highly significant and they make us realize once again of how important it is to have a global perspective. As Nelson was saying, on the internet there's more than 5 billion users, so an impact on the internet will affect millions of people. And we must say that this is something we already know, and it is repeated regularly. There are terms and conditions, contracts, conferences and events that are held, but that affect many, many more people of the inhabitants of the most populated countries in the world. There can be, there may be people who are subject to the same terms and conditions with indicators regarding personal data protection, and these should be aligned with the essential principles and the fundamental right of personal data protection. This is why collaboration is essential. This is why I think, and Andrea pointed this out, that the role in Europe of the IDBD is crucial. I think it's one of the most important consequences after the approval of the Gdpr. And this is the strengthening of the role of the European Data Protection Committee. The committee is called upon to play an essential role in unifying the right of data protection through statements that are foreseen in Article 64 of the regulation, or through the roles established in Article 70. And we must also take into account something that is important. On May 25th of 2018, something took place that had never happened before in the history of law and maybe even of humanity. The general law for data protection became almost a worldwide application from one day to the next. And that led to the extraterritorial application of the regulation, which I do believe is essential. So the matter is that we have to look for a formula that will manage to get cooperation and collaboration among officials also outside Europe, that it be effective. And I think we have to look for juridical formulas that will enable that effective collaboration. Unfortunately, in the sphere of independent officials collaborating and in the application of decisions made by independent officials, we don't have anything similar that closely resembles The Hague on the execution and recognition of sentences. That is, we don't have an agreement that allows for the execution of decisions. There is no such thing. It's clear that today we cannot have a similar tool because that agreement said that the sentences that are executed are not susceptible of recourse in the original country. So we have to be very, very aware of that. And we are, that the independent authorities on data protection, these are administrative decisions that can be opposed in courts. So what we're seeing is a problem in the recognition and execution of the resolutions of authorities. This, I'm talking about going beyond the European Union. The European Union has its problems, but as Andrea has told us with a very significant data, she has said how those 277 decisions are operating, that is very, very important, even more so than we can imagine. So I think the aim is to generate a general and overall model for data protection based on common principles. And those principles should be the recognition of fundamental rights, the recognition of the centrality and the dignity of the person, of the identity in the digital area. And with this, I conclude. I think there's a very close relationship between law and science, or between law and technique, and the law should not become obsolete. And it is in this sense that the Article 24 of the Gdpr regulation is essential, because Article 24 stipulates that whatever the state of the science is, the important thing is that fundamental rights be respected. That is the key. Cooperation, collaboration should make sure that rights are protected. And I want to conclude, but if the moderator allows me, I would like to mention 3 persons who are no longer with us, sadly, but who were crucial in fighting for international collaboration. Emilio Ahed, who worked in the Spanish Agency for Data Protection, Stefano Rodota, and Giovanni Buttarelli. 3 persons who are not with us today, and yet they are exemplary in collaboration and cooperation. Examples in trying to establish a global data protection model. And the United Nations, by the way, should also be a protagonist in this. And the role of the rapporteur in data protection, I think, is very important. The new rapporteur, our friend Ana Bien, was just appointed. But yes, I think the UN needs to play a more protagonistic role. They should assume this task and be a bigger protagonist in order to drive forth a global model for data protection. Thank you. Protection. Sorry. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias.
In your new capacity, but you're still remembering a lot of things that you were doing, especially regionally when you were in the national authority in Spain. And now we're going to move forward to a little bit of the discussion. I want to start off from one of the points that you were saying, especially Andrea was stressing on the different traditions and how you put them together with the general framework. In the case of Nelson Remolina, one of the things he was highlighting is, of course, in the case in Latin America, you have different also traditions, but also how to put all together, especially in this case of impunity, because you have now not only national problems or national issues, but regional and global. So one of the things I want to provoke you in the discussion is you were talking about the good things and in some other. Now try to let's move to the challenges and the difficulties that you have to face as a network, because when you're talking as a national authority is one thing, when you are moving and talking about the network it's differently, because when you're a national authority you have to enforce your regulations and your normative and your legislative framework. But as a collection of authorities, it's a different approach. It's not only about thinking about citizens around the world, but you have to focus in different ways, especially you have different traditions. So I'm going to start off now with Nelson Remolina, probably telling us what are the challenges about to bring it together a network and to keep it together. And of course, secondly, this is for the three of you. Of course, this question is the difficulties, but also what kind of tools or what kind of let's say, well, tools. It's a good definition to bring them together, to keep it together, and to fostering cooperation in your network. This is important because we are people from Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand are listening to us right now and probably want to understand better about the experiences in this network, especially when it comes to Europe and Latin America. So we're going to start off with Nelson and probably to talking a little bit about this. Nelson, you have the floor.
Gracias, Christopher. Yo destacaría.
Thank you, Christopher. I would highlight two things. Yes, I would highlight two items in data protection in Latin America. 85% of our constitutions in Latin America refer to information of people and their protection. Some are more detailed, for example, the Dominican Republic right now, and also Mexico with its constitutional reforms. Chile also had something recently. So what I'm saying is that in Latin America, the protection of this right is at the highest level of the juridical levels, that is in the Constitution. That doesn't happen everywhere in the world. It's important to not lose sight of that. Every country has its own regulation. There is the regulatory sovereignty of every country. So what they do in the network is that in those internal regulations, there are minimal things that are the product of that international regulation that before the 1980s, for example, the OECD, the European Union, the Asia-Pacific region, and of course the Assembly for the data protection, as José Luis mentioned, and the Madrid standards of 2009. So there's an exercise already that has been carried out for harmonizing so that when these local regulations are issued, they have a minimum to guarantee a human right, but also that the regulations do not become an obstacle for the development of other things that are legal, like trade. So here we have to be in a middle point, a balancing point, and in that sense the American network, the Ibero-American standards, IB 17 that were approved in Chile, if we think of the documents for the network, the recommendations emitted by the network in 2019 for the treatment of data, for example, during a pandemic, the reference document has the standards, but the standards come from the harmonization established in different countries. So in the world, the regulatory role is very significant. How do we keep the authorities working together? Well, I think the millions of people who own the data, they are the ones that keep them together. I think this is the biggest economic, social, and political protagonism of the last 25 years after the internet. So I think as authorities, we have to be working in a united manner because those millions of people are demanding it from us so we can provide a better service. And the American Network of Data Protection, it's been around for 18 years, and more, it is doing more things, holding more frequent meetings, issuing more documents. So it has its own pace. And I believe that for the authorities, they see that the network's not going to replace the authority, but it can support the role of those authorities in a country and seek better conditions for people's data protection. For example, a network in a country that has no regulation, and we see this clearly, but this doesn't necessarily happen all over the world. So why is it important to have a data protection authority that is strong and autonomous and efficient? So I think the final reason that will help us to work together are the people themselves, the citizens themselves, because what we are seeing, and I can tell you about Colombia. In Colombia, the authorities have been working on this for 10 years. And while there were over 1,100 complaints, today there are more than 2,000. So more and more people are aware of this right. And more they resort to the authorities to wage their complaints. This is why we have to join our internal and external efforts to make this process very rigorous, because this right is not exempt from other rights. It has to be protected. It's very hard for this right to be protected at all times. Authorities have a very hard time doing that, but there are efforts and things that can be done. And this happens with this right as with many other rights. So I think the main motive for stronger networks are those more than 5 billion internet users throughout the world. This is why we said, like we said this morning at the inaugural, we cannot just sit with our arms crossed. We have to be much more proactive. We have to act officially and innovate in order to achieve better results. Thank you. Muchísimas.
Now to Andrea to continue on this topic, especially in the experience in the European Union, and of course in Austria, if you want to talk about this experience, and especially how to bring all together, especially when you're coming from different traditions. Our tradition is not only about parliamentarian or centralist, federalist, but also how you understand this right itself on privacy and data protection. So the first years in there.
Uh, I, we can hear you.
Andrea, for some reason we cannot hear you, and the translation is not able to translate because they cannot see you. Probably there's some issue with your microphone. Uh, we see that your microphone is on, but probably it's a question of the connection. We are trying to find out if there's something on our side. But just if you want to check out on your cables and your computer, and probably we can start over.
Now? Okay. I just tried. Does it work? Just tell me. Christopher, do you? Okay. Thanks, Jose. So you asked regarding the tools, how to bring the supervisory authorities together, how to keep them together, and how to foster cooperation. The European Data Protection Board didn't start from scratch because, as you all know, the Working Party 29 was the predecessor of the European Data Protection Board. But now we are a European independent body and we are working together closer than we did before. Article 70 of the GDPR provides more than, I think it's from A to Y. Yes, these are the tasks of the European Data Protection Board, and these tasks shows how we can keep our different approaches together and make it better for the sake of the people. And we are cooperating in many expert subgroups. And these expert subgroups are preparing the papers, the opinions, and guidelines for the board. And in addition, we have the secretariat, which is supporting the board in either in organizational matters, but also in legal items. So it's very important to note that we have an exchange system which we use for our cooperation. For sure, we use email and telephone too, but we have this internal market system which we use for our cooperation in the cases, which is very important that you have a secure system to exchange the information. How we how are we going to keep our relationship together? Our staff members have daily uh, telephone calls. They are exchanging, I don't know how many times a day, all the 31 supervisory authorities are working very close together, either as lead supervisory authority or as concerned supervised authority in our cross-border cases. And as you know, to foster cooperation, you have to talk to each other and to exchange inf- information as much as you can do. You know, during the COVID-19 pandemic, everything got into the internet, also the board meetings. And but I'm really looking forward to our first in-person meeting, which should take place in November 2021. Because, as you know, nothing is better than personal contact. And you know, we have to look after the consistent application of the GDPR. So we have the same goal. We have a common goal, and it's the same issue that, as Nelson said, we have to be there for the people who need us. And I think that close cooperation between Africa, Asia, Europe, US, America, and Latin America is really important, especially also because of our cross border data transfers. Because, as Jose Luis already said, the protection of the data must travel with the data, not only within Europe, also across the world. So that's the first try of an answer. Christopher?
Thank you very much. Apologies on all these technical problems and technicalities. Is we have been going on through this thing during the pandemic, going virtual, but still we are dealing with a lot of stuff when it comes to connection. Now we're going to move forward to Jose Luis Piñar. I'm probably going to add a little question, especially for him. How you see all this process about cooperation and strengthening networks and so forth, but also how you see it now from the outside, because you used to be part of all this process when you were part of the Spanish national authority, but now how you see it from the outside? Are there still the same challenges that you used to see when you were in the authority? If you provide one or two of your thoughts, will be really helpful for the people who are listening.
Yes, let's see. This is a very important issue. It is evident that collaboration is essential. Definitely, I was able to participate, as Nelson said, and Nelson was also protagonist of the birth of the Latin American Network of Data Protection in 2003. There were only a few data protection laws in Latin America. And we saw the need of having or fostering a global model for data protection for several reasons. On one hand, in order to have a global model based on common principles and common traditions that stemmed from the consideration of data protection as a fundamental right. That's unquestionable. And on the other hand, the conviction on the need of facilitating data transfers. Before, we talked about the economic value of data treatment today. We can't hinder the circulation of data as long as we start with the premise of data protection. So the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulations, have two important sections. It is regulations to guarantee data protection and the free circulation of private data. And from the guideline 9546, this was very clear. So there are still problems indeed. And being outside this authority, we can detect that the relationship between innovation and the right and globalization is still a huge challenge, and the legal frameworks should try to look for solutions, but efficient solutions. And I think this requires, as it was said before, a constant dialogue, but not only between authorities, but also a dialogue with all the stakeholders who have something to say with respect to data protection, the public sector, the private sector, law enforcement. It is important, as the European Committee does and the network does. We have to listen to those who have problems in private data treatment. So I think dialogue and conversations are essential. Dialogue of all the stakeholders. I have to say, and my apologies for daring to do so, when I was in the authority, maybe we didn't listen enough to all the sectors involved. The authority was closed, and that risk has to be avoided. Now there's a great dialogue and then having legal instruments that allow the effectiveness of collaboration, and that's a great issue for us. It's very difficult to find a legal tool that responds to collaboration so that collaboration gives rise to the execution and the effectiveness of said collaboration. And I understand that's complicated. I see from my perspective that we've taken huge steps, and an essential step is the GDPR. And the principles it contains are becoming the model worldwide for data protection. And this is something we have to leverage. As Andrea said, with the adaptation decisions, the PCRs, I think that's a consensus. The model is the regulation. And we have to see how we can implement efficiently the data protection model designed by the regulation.
We are moving now last quarter of this talk. I want to put in the table another set of questions in order to continue these conversations. And of course, we have been talking about from the authorities' perspective and the regional perspective of the authorities. But as we continue building up our national frameworks or our regional frameworks, the data flows keeps going, and of course the economic dynamic keeps going. Of course, the economic actors keep creating new ways of sharing data, and of course, really creative, and even they know the legislation, and they want to move forward in order to avoid some of the things, or because the dynamic of the industries create new ways for data flows. So, of course, we are trying to consolidate regional standards, regional principles. How we try to have this dialogue with all the economic actors, and at the same time to create a framework, a regional framework, or regional frameworks to face the new challenges. So, not to talk about from the authoritative perspective, but this conversation that Jose Luis Piñar was telling that sometimes was lacking during your time, probably is the key right now, because the most of the time we are talking, I was telling, we talk every day, sometimes twice, third time per day, and we have this communication. How often we have the communication with economic actors, and what are the challenges when we include these actors into the picture? So probably we can have your thoughts on this, how to have let's say a debate or dialogue between the economic actors and the authorities in order to preserve and still guarantee rights, especially when it comes to privacy and data protection, but other to avoid to be stop or to detain the economic consolidation, regionally speaking. So I'm going to move to this question to firstly, in the same order, to Nelson, then to Andrea, and then to Jose Luis, if may I. So Nelson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Before answering, I'd like to mention something that was said earlier, and I think it is relevant to make a reflection on that. With respect to international data flow, regulations have focused mainly on the international data transfer or cross-border data circulation. And the standards are focused on data exporters. We demand data exporters either to have clauses or binding corporate rules, or that they send their information to countries with adequate data protection, but they ban transfers and they demand the exporter to comply with some standards. That's okay, but it's not enough, because after internet, I think that data of the citizens of one country are not being transferred because someone sends them to another country. It's not that someone from Mexico send them to Colombia, but rather someone from Colombia with technology, they gather data. So I think we have left aside the international data collection. Today, we have more data coming from countries via international connection rather than transfers. That's my perspective. And I think that that front is not being covered. So we're concerned about protection of data of our citizens when they leave the country. So we should work on international data protection, because I've always said that international data collectors is like a fisherman that puts its fishing rod on the internet and collects data from everywhere, and that no one controls that collection. It's technologically feasible. So that's the point that we have to address a lot, because we've been focusing on sending data. We've talked about the continuity data protection when data leave a country. Those same standards are respected in the country of destination. But I think that data collection, we're not doing almost nothing, but I think we need to strengthen that aspect. Now, I fully agree with what you said, that the regulations, and not only the regulations, but the way to protect data. This has to be discussed. We have to create dialogues, constructive dialogues, with all the stakeholders. In the Latin American Network of Data Protection, for instance, we've created channels to this end. And these work groups, this year, especially, we created a group of the internet industry, and the authority that coordinates this group is Uruguay. Why? What for? To listen to proposals from the industry, but also we have a group of citizens, NGOs that represent citizens, because in this dialogue, we have to take citizens into account. You know that when there's a regulation, those who have more lobbying capacity are not citizens, but rather companies. That's the reality. There's a very interesting documentary of the European regulations regarding its creation. It took 3 years. I think that a document that took so much dialogue, an example of this is the European one. So there are important changes compared to the original version. And that was because of that dialogue. I know there are no perfect standards. There are many approaches. We have to see how we can achieve the best for everyone, but I could do the following. We have to see how we can convince those who have our data to make an ethical and correct treatment of that data. And I think that only by developing standards and imposing sanctions is not enough. We have to create, for instance, strategies that we already know about of the reputation of the organizations, because those who have our data, usually if they are business people and if their business model is around data, and their customers are the ones who give wealth and profits, that's legal, that's okay, but we have to convince that business person to treat their customers' data properly. So if you make a living of your customers, treat them well. And also because of the standards, and also because this produces trust in businesses. As you know, having a good name is not easy, and sometimes it is impossible to recover your reputation. And we've seen how with things that are happening, some citizens prefer to turn to another organization. Why? Because they trust more other organizations with respect to data treatment. This morning, since 1999, a colleague mentioned a book, how according to some surveys, citizens prefer to do business with companies that are more trustworthy with respect to data treatment. And I think that we should also put this on the table, but we have to keep on working on them as well, because it's not only about regulations. You know, and I have to be very honest, there are companies that with a fine, they pay the fine. It's a minimum percentage of their profits. And perhaps within their budget, they allocate the payment of fines for failing to comply with data protection, because for some organizations, it is more economically attractive violating data standards than abiding by them. So that's the reality. And this is what sometimes happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially because you were stressing on the fact that it's a question of how businesses are made. And this important information, you were saying that the largest amount of data flow is not about how companies share data between or among each other. It's about how customers go and try to get a service or product from somewhere else, and that's the reason they are sharing. So there are these challenges when it comes to data protection. Now we're going to go to Andrea in the same way to talk about the challenges, not from the authorities' point of view and the networking point of view, but also we include companies and economic agents. So Andrea, the floor is yours. I think we are having some problems with Andrea audio. Shall you agree? Forward to Jose Luis Piñar, and at the end we're gonna come back to Andrea. In the meantime, she's going to check out on the connection. So Jose Luis, if you agree, we can continue with you with the same questions and topics.
Yes, the challenges for data protection are huge, and they are always new. Here we are talking about one, which I think is quite relevant, which is globalization. The interaction of local regulations and sectorial regulations in a global world. And that's an issue that hasn't been addressed, although collaboration is essential, and I insist on the importance on the GDPR. Now, I fully agree with what you said about the market and the big multinationals. The goodwill damage is huge, and many companies avoid damaging their reputation if they are subject to a fine. Nelson said very well that paying a fine, maybe a billionaire fine for some companies, is nothing. But for sure, the damage to their reputation is significant. And it has happened. Even the shares of that company have decreased because citizens increasingly appreciate privacy and that a company respects their data protection or privacy. There are many advertising campaigns that this company equals privacy or data protection. So I think this is quite important, but there are other challenges that are concern for me. And it is above all the challenges of being before a right like data protection, whose violation can be unnoticed. I'm going to explain why. Oftentimes, the holders of data are not aware that their will is being manipulated and they are being profiled, that people are being alienated, and that decisions are being made according to those who want to make the decisions. The other day, there was an advertising campaign in Madrid, the right to not to have to decide. When we talk about the right not to decide, they are telling us, forget everything. I'm going to tell you what you like, what is convenient for you, what suits you, what you have to do, the decisions you have to make. I will take those decisions for you. And that's very serious because this affects the dignity and the identity of the person. And I'm especially concerned by the challenge of neuro rights. Chile has taken an important step to recognize neuro rights. In Spain, we approved a digital rights charter that recognizes new rights. And practically all digital rights have something to do with data treatment. I like to understand that they have to do with data treatment, but this is a huge challenge as well, because if they can read our minds, the final aspect of privacy disappears. That's why I insist on dialogue, and also dialogue with scientists, so that they can tell us where science is going, what science is capable to do, and what it will be capable to do in the short and medium terms, in order to react timely, so that the right is not violated. So I think those are the most important challenges.
Thank you very much, José Luis. We are welcome, Marguerite. I know you have some problem for connecting.
Hola,
Thank you
Marguerite.
very much for
Hello,
joining
Marguerite.
us.
Oui,
I
je
know
vous entends. Je m'excuse pour le retard. J'avais
technologies
des
are
problèmes de
tricky and we have a lot
connexion.
of glitches. But shall you agree? Probably, of course, we can have like
Vous
a space for you.
m'entendez?
Because you have been missing the most of the conversation, but you have a lot to say, especially from the African perspective. And yeah, if you are okay, probably we can go to Marguerite, and then you can finish with all this, especially for me, it's important to give the floor, especially for women, because we need more women representation, especially when it comes to this important. So Marguerite, the floor is yours.
Je vous remercie. J'espère que vous m'entendez tous. On n'entend pas?
Marguerite, can you hear us?
Of Marguerite, maybe she's already back.
No tengo el relay. No tengo el relay. Ah, yeah. The introduction has been made, and once there is cooperation, and I will talk about the cooperation policies at a regional level. As an introduction, I would like to mention the information that is available in order to create social relations, whether economic ones. This is a big change because of the disparity and from that point of view, we have a whole set of measures to protect humankind. The data revolution should be within a technological framework and democratic institutions must rather protect society, but very often they are lacking the framework. And if such framework does not exist, then we must think about the rights and the standards and the laws so that there is a real right. what are the necessary measures in order to reach a worldwide protection that will provide guarantee to people's personal data? What are the difficulties because of a lack of networks? And what are the results that have been obtained despite the networks? So we must create a worldwide strategy for data protection. I think we have to take away the territorial nature of laws and regulations and standards in order to and reduce this idea of powers, and rather we should create mechanisms and work jointly for the protection of personal private data. When we're speaking of borders, we have to think about the trans-border transfer of data, but also within borders. So legal standards should be established. And this refers to different legal systems and different approaches in today's world. The whole concept may be seen differently depending on what country you're in. For example, there is personal information and public information. And we should have a system for the application that corresponds to the different nations. Yes, of course, there may be differences in the different countries regarding the idea of data protection, but we should reach a common idea for data protection. We need to take action and have an exchange without borders, a harmonization of laws and standards, regional laws, for example, that may be applied. For example, in Africa, the CDO was the first regional organization that was interested in the problem of data protection. This was a CEDEAO. And this shows us that this awareness in how states should react in face of progress, and then also in how to apply the different measures and go against the lack of data protection. And then after that, harmonization in how data is protected. In fact, the agreement that talks about data protection goes more in depth and talks about a political will. This institutional organism for data protection in Africa its viewpoint is that it guarantees any form of protecting fundamental rights of people. At the same time, it takes into accounts the prerogatives of the states, the rights of local communities, the interests of businesses. The European Council, which is an international organization, promotes the right of mankind, democratic development and cultural cooperation among European countries. In 1981, the CDE adopted the Agreement 108 regarding the protection of people and the automatic treatment of data that is personal. Every regional politic has a significant influence on the policy regarding internet in the world. When there is no formal regulation, the companies from a certain sector sometimes create their own codes, behavioral codes for their members. Self-regulation, for example, it consists of standards and good practices for the sector, ethical codes, the social responsibility of companies, self-regulatory example. This was announced by Facebook in 2020 about the creation of a supervision council that can cancel some and modify the content of Facebook. Instead of waiting for a formal government policy, Facebook proposes a self-regulatory approach regarding the regulation of content. And then the Francophone Association for officials in charge of personal protection data. It is a way to exchange views among those countries that have French in common. They propose working hand in hand with states and authorities in order to develop a local expertise in matters of personal data protection, with the support of the experience of the member authorities in their network. This organization brings together only the African authorities whose mission is to promote and look after the protection of personal data in their countries. The states who foresee legislating the protection of personal data, as well as the association and African organizations, they are also involved. What are the advantages and the results from this new network? Well, the establishment of networks, authorities' networks for protection, this has many advantages. The regulation of data flow across borders, sharing the experience in the domain of data protection, the formulation of common policies, the harmonization also of the data. And what are some of the difficulties that have been found? Well, there are many. Among them, we can name the linguistic barriers, the cultural diversity. For example, in India and in Nepal, private life and personal information refers to informations on the caste. Also, the generalization of the ICT use, the protection of data protection is not a priority in many parts of governments and enterprises. So this needs to be looked at in a more specific and particular manner. The looking at the private life that often is not aware of the current challenges or the lack of resources among officials for data protection. The false perception of the BDP as an obligation instead of as a facilitator for using the ICDs, and also the absence of synergies and working in silos. In conclusion, the TICs today are aware of an exponential evolution. This means that every single state must surround itself with solid bases to protect the personal data of its citizens, and this protection cannot be done in a closed environment. So in order to respond to this preoccupation, the synergy of the actors in the digital ecosystem continues to be a need for harmonizing the protection mechanisms. Thank you. Thank you so much, and I am sorry for the delay.
When it comes to the challenges in Africa, you were saying is in some cases data protection is not a priority, not even the government or nor the companies and so forth. So the challenges are huge, huge. We're gonna move forward to Andrea for the. We have some problems in the connection. Probably you can explain a little bit more of the things we were discussing, but probably because we have only 10 minutes left, probably you can start with your final intervention, especially when the things you have been talking on these general standards that the European Union is doing. So you have the floor, Andrea.
Thank you, Christopher. I hope you can understand me now. Do you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thanks. I just want to answer to your question from before regarding how do we speak, or if we speak with the stakeholders, with the companies. Yes, we do. Either we do stakeholder events from the ETPP, or we make sector meetings. And what you mustn't forget is we put most of our guidelines under public consultation, and we get the contributions of the stakeholders. The recommendations after the Schrems II judgment, we sent also under public consultation, and we got more than 200 contributions, and we put them together and also put them into our recommendations. And I think this is a very important way to have a dialogue with the stakeholders. And I think what Nelson said before, that we need a closer look to the international connection in data, not only to the transfer of data, is really very, very important. And it was also that José Luis addressed, how do we convince those who have our data to treat our data in an ethical way? I think this is a common goal of all of us, and we have to convince them either in supporting them as regulators, but not as their lawyers, because they have their lawyers. And if they don't want to cooperate, there is the opportunity to fine, but it is not the first goal from us as supervisory authorities to fine companies. But I think as last exit, it is very important that we have this measure. But my attempt is, and my approach is, and the approach of the supervisory authorities and of the ETPP is cooperation, and try to get them to act as it is, because data protection is a fundamental right and it has to be respected. And I think this already were my final words too, if you agree.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We have just 5 minutes left. I will pass the floor to Nelson, to José Luis, to Andrea, and to Marguerite, just for 1 minute final reflections or final words, because we need to move forward to the next session. But just if you want to have some final remarks or something, so we're going to move really quickly, just for 1 minute each. And of course, our deep grateful for being here in this conversation. Nelson.
Oui, je vous remercie pour l'écoute et je dirais pour qu'une bonne promotion du droit à la protection des données
para
personnelles,
agradecer de nuevo al INAI y a México por organizar este evento y dejar planteado algo que ya mencionamos todo y es la enorme responsabilidad que tenemos frente a este derecho que nos afecta a todos y rescatar que la humanidad por...
The humanity for a long time was always fighting to uphold human rights. We have to continue that, and we have to look for the intelligent, updated means so that we can go into this technological era, good for business, but also for data protection. As we have said, data are like oxygen. I think human beings, we are present in everything, and in any activity we carry out, we should do so well and respecting the rights of others. Greetings to everyone.
Muchas gracias, muy querido.
Thank you, Nelson. José Luis. Thank you. Christopher. It has been a pleasure to share this panel with Andrea, Nelson, Marguerite. As always, I have learned a lot. We're always learning a great deal in these sessions. And I just want to say one final thing. And I will dare, Christopher, allow me, to paraphrase Benito Juarez as if that were something small. Benito Juarez says that the respect to the other's right is peace. I would say the respect for the other's data is peace. If we know that data also always belongs to others, they are the owners of that data, and if we respect them, then we can move peacefully, but with common sense. Common sense. It is very, very important to have a great deal of common sense in data protection because, as I have said before, it is one of the most crucial aspects of the 21st century because it affects the dignity and identity of people and the free development of personalities. But to do this, we have to have enormous dosages of common sense. When I was in the agency, I used to say that the worst that one can be is to be a data fundamentalist. We have to protect the protection of personal data, but drawing red lines that cannot be crossed. But at the same time, to do so with common sense and knowing that there are many actors involved.
Muchas gracias. I'd like to Marguerite because she had so much troubles in connection and has many things to say. And I just want to underline what José Luis and Nelson said. I don't want to repeat it. So please, Marguerite, muchas gracias.
Merci bien. Je voudrais juste revenir et insister encore sur le fait que c'est par la coopération que nous pourrons mener à bien notre mission en matière de protection des données personnelles, que nous pourrons mieux protéger les données personnelles de nos concitoyens par les échanges d'expériences, le renforcement de nos capacités et l'accent sur la coopération aussi bien régionale qu'internationale. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. I think we have some problems with the translation going, but thank you very much to the four of you.
Sorry, we had some technical problems and we were unable to listen to Marguerite's answer. sería muy útil poder escucharte más a ti en la próxima reunión. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
In the end, thank you very much for all your remarks, for all your useful talks and reflections. And thank you very much. And please bear with us. We're going to continue having the next session. Thank you very much. Good evening and good night in the European and the African region. Good afternoon here in America.
Adiós y hasta la próxima vez.